Thanks everybody for coming this morning to the first of the Bloomberg Breakfast Conversations. This is the first of a series of conversations that are going to be running over the course of the next 5 days. The conversation today is titled Not the Future We Were Promised, Technology, How Does It Meet Our Expectations? And to kind of, the main focus of the discussion is considering some of the promises that were made in the period of around the 1950s and 60s of a future state of potential post-scarcity, flying cars, jetpacks and things like this, and the way that these promises didn't quite play out. And what we actually ended up with was something quite radically different. But in this moment, there's a series of new promises that are being made about the future in the form of big data, smart cities, the cloud, and what I'd like to do today is begin to interrogate some of those subjects and try to think about what the kind of future trajectory of that stuff is. But it's also kind of interesting to consider that in this moment, some of the past promises that were made around space travel and things like that are actually coming into fruition, in that we have 2 space hotels currently circulating the planet, which is kind of a thing that isn't commonly known, and actually in the next 10 to 15 years we might actually begin to see those things happening. But it's sometimes difficult to think about technology operating on that kind of scale and how that actually relates to you as an individual. So the speakers that we have today are Nell Breyer, who's the Director of Programming and Education at the Kennedy Institute, Paul Pieroni, who's the Curator of Space Program in London, and Space the Gallery, not a space program, although if you want to take that lead, that'd be great. And Andrew Norman Wilson, who's a New York-based artist. So to start the conversation, there's a really good thread on Reddit a couple of years ago. And I think this kind of gives a good underpinning to where we might go with this conversation in terms of personal relationships to technology. But somebody asked, if someone from the 1950s suddenly appeared today, what would be the most difficult thing to explain to them about life today? And the top-rated answer to this question was, I possess a device in my pocket that is capable of accessing the entirety of information known to man. I use it to look at pictures of cats and get into arguments with strangers. So on starting there, if I could ask Nell to kind of introduce some of the subjects that you work around and your personal relationship to technology, and maybe to pose the first question of, do you feel optimistic about the future?
Which of those questions should I answer first?
I think if you start just explaining kind of where your work revolves around, and then maybe just kind of tail off with whether you feel optimistic about the future or not.
So I have been thinking a lot about how the public uses technology, how we share through basic technologies, and how that shapes meaning for us. I've been also, in the course of my artistic work, thinking a lot about how action makes meaning. So that's how it became, an action about sharing and doing, as opposed to actions involving writing down words. It's a pretty abstract answer, but that's it. Am I optimistic? I don't know. This is a difficult time. I think that this possibility, I don't know, ask me, I don't know. I'd say it's a challenge to the resources and the capabilities that we have. It's a responsibility and a lot of possibility as well.
Paul?
Oh God. I don't know. I felt like you were maybe proposing a notion of the future that was quite materialistic, i.e. like an object-oriented future, i.e. we would know we were in the future because there'd be flying cars and hoverboards, etc. But I really feel like I'm in the future. Like I wake up, and it's not because of some object that presents its futurism. It's because maybe something deeper, which might be like a future of subjectivity, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and I think that's a really interesting question in relation to art. So I'm worried we're not going to talk about art in this situation. I mean, I think we should talk about art, not just technology. So I don't know anything about technology, and I don't know anything about art, but I think raising the question of how from that progressive military-industrial context of technology in the 40s and 50s, right, the sort of post-war accelerationist mandate of technology through to the 60s, through the kind of occupation of technology via, say, the non-professional, supposedly for social emancipation, through to now where we all have access to this stuff. I think raising that question with regards to subjectivity and specifically artistic subjectivity is for me the question, right? So it's not stuff, it's people.
Can I jump in on anything? Because I think that what you're identifying is this really important voice that artistic experience has on, if you're talking about major shifts, like the three major shifts, like the way information is transferred, or that's radically changed in the last decade. The way money is transferred has radically changed. We operate in a debt society. The way that service and the things we produce is also radically changed. We're not really an object manufacturing world anymore. We're a service provider. So those three unbelievable transactional shifts have altered the entire globe. And when you create work, which most often, or many artists do, that looks at how we embed value on something, that they can articulate well that weird shift in transaction. So suddenly the things that have meaning aren't the ability to make the thing itself, it's the ability to provide the thing that makes the thing itself, or that you have a bettable, you're a potential expensive value. I don't know how to describe debt and leverage debt, but there's a total shift in where the value comes from, and I think the framing of that art really has a strong tool set to do that, to get us to have an critical
and I think in terms of the way that artists work with these kinds of things, and a very common misunderstanding when you see kind of young artists working with technology is the assumption is that it's this kind of surface technology that is dealing with the aesthetics of technology, but commonly actually it's talking about distribution and the kind of distributed sites of those where those things play out.
But that it's a thing, right? That it's somehow discrete, which it isn't. It's completely all permeating. And I think even like the framing of this discourse is skewed, because by objectifying the thing, by granting it its discretion, we create a kind of invisible kind of distance. I mean, I think really, for me, the question of technology and subjectivity is about the impossibility of kind of parsing the world so that one bit is this and one bit's that with regards to technology. It just is.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's quite a good point to kind of bring Norman's work in relation to like the Google complex and the scanning and the traces of the human hand. Maybe it'd be interesting to explain that work a little bit.
Yeah, so at the core of a lot of my work is just investigation of materiality, and usually that leads me towards an interest in labor. And so I worked for Google for almost a year as a video editor, and while there I was really kind of fascinated by the experience of being in the same room with the same people for 9 hours a day. And so now that I'm not engaged in that type of work, and I think this is happening a lot, especially with artists, where you don't have one set workplace, and labor is becoming much more flexible. And I think that the way in which network communications are rearranging how labor is performed or organized is radically changing the ways in which money flows and everything. But in terms of what was happening at Google, there were these book scanning workers who were basically processing the world's libraries, books, for Google Books Online. And so they'd literally turn a page and press a button. And so it was this very, like Fordist form of labor. And I noticed them leaving the factory that they were at, that they worked in, in this kind of unidirectional manner. And so I set my camera up outside and recorded them leaving as the Lumieres did in 1895 in their film Workers Leaving the Factory. And so it was this very bizarre kind of like hybrid of digital but also mechanical labor, where they were turning these pages and then a bell would go off and they'd have to leave the factory. And so it was like this displacement of a prior form of labor into the present on this campus and in this workplace setting that's become recognized as like privileging their employees over or more than other companies are, typically do. And what was especially strange about this type of labor is that the privileges that Google is famous for wasn't offered to these workers. And so they couldn't ride the bikes, they couldn't go in any of the other buildings, they couldn't eat the free Google meals, they weren't given the backpacks, they couldn't take the shuttles up to San Francisco like I could. They just get in their cars and leave. And then like race and class was an obvious component where, you know, they all were generally black and Latino, and they seemed pretty young, you know, like just out of high school. And after talking to them, I realized that they, you know, most of them were just there for very temporary labor contracts. There was like a high turnover rate just due to the monotony of the work. And so, yeah, I made this video and got fired. And then once I was fired, I started looking into Google Books, and I can actually pull an image up just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. I started finding workers' hands on Google Books. And so these are those people that I had this kind of proximity to while at Google, but never was actually able to really get to know, just because of the way in which they were sequestered on this part of campus. And so now there's the video, and that went viral, and Google saw it, and they haven't approached me for any sort of legal action. And now I'm developing this work called ScanOps that deals with, you know, finding these hands, and I'm trying to frame them as both literally and figuratively as photographs, because they aren't scans. It's actually performed by a human being, and it's not with a book face down, it's with a book facing upwards. And there are two cameras overhead, and so it's this very it's this very kind of standardized process. And they have this big stack, and they go through it during the day. And actually that office has closed because they've done all of the books that they can do from that region. Yeah.
I mean, how does that kind of reflect in terms of that, the visibility of labour that happens in that, and the potentially that actually very little has changed around these kind of structures and ways of working, and what these kind of technologies actually enable? I mean, at once you have the kind of factory where people are performing a form of forced labour, but then at the same time you have the kind of open source hardware movement that allows for actually for you to build these book scanners yourself. But for what reason, as an individual, would you want to scan the entirety of like the world's library? Like what kind of motivates those kind of actions? I mean, you work a lot around kind of sharing economy and stuff like that.
I mean, now you have all the libraries that are, you know, jumping to join the Digital Public Library of America. You have a massive, and you have the European equivalent. There's a massive understanding that from the institutions of the libraries that they want to do this. They want to have a public source based distribution method and move in where Google Books failed.
Right.
Because otherwise they'll be obsolete, because no one will read books, period. Like, that's what they've understood. They're in the business of trying to keep themselves alive, and they want to use, now whether, how that scanning happens is a pretty diverse actually across at least the institutions that I've seen that are involved. But it's an interesting, you know, how do you compare that with what workers would have been doing 500 years ago, or what do you compare it to, or I mean, that's very, you know, that's a complicated question.
Yeah.
It's important to think about, and how much technology has changed the problems of dividing our different societies and creating barriers, and it's still there. It's still there. It's still a major.
But it's potentially something that we will see shift in the next 5 to 10 years as the price of certain forms of communication are increasingly dropping at an exponential rate. The prospect of actually seeing the other half of the planet come online and what that direct communication begins to mean for us there is some kind of potential for something radically different
I think
in
you
that.
see models, like with the Grumming phone and the microfinancing, you see models where some technologies help jump the need for creating a full infrastructure for a preceding technology, and you can have the Bangladeshi women doing business on their phone without having electricity, or without having good electricity in where they are in their village. But I think there's still problems of access.
Yeah, and you see, like, the Indian government recently just kind of bought up something like 12 million kind of touchpads that $20 each, and they actually figured out that it's much cheaper to distribute tablets to children throughout India than it is to buy the textbooks and ship them to individuals. But what comes along with that kind of process is not just the reading of textbooks, but the other things that exist on those devices, and the kind of curiosity that evolves when you're introduced to the world's information on a single tablet. I mean, it's very, very difficult to imagine what effect and impact that will have on a 20-year trajectory. And I think that's kind of this, what do you expect from the future of technology, and what are your expectations around technology? That's where some questions begin to evolve that are actually very, very difficult to answer, because I don't know.
But it's just not going to be the imposition of the centre, right? It's just going to be a sort of techno-colonialism. It's certainly not going to be a porous exchange. It's going to be, right, here's your new empire, deal with it. There may be some reciprocity, but and I think that's interesting in terms of kind of art production. You'll just get a lot of Indian post-internet artists.
Are you sure?
Yeah, it will. Whatever kind of mythology of alternative modernisms has fueled, say, the contemporary art fetish with globalization over the last 20 years, will no doubt be flattened and replaced by centrist, cookie-cutter, internet-infused art. I mean, I'm talking about art, I don't know about other stuff, but it seems evident that there's a kind of tyranny to the informational arrangement that you're talking about. I mean, maybe I'm super pessimistic about these things, obviously, but I genuinely believe that any sort of utopian view with regards to the informational exchange around our world is maybe misguided, in as much as there is really like a pretty central ideological game at play, I think, with post-internet culture.
Mm-hmm.
I don't mean post-internet art, I mean literally post-internet culture. And it's interesting what Norm was saying about the labour thing, and kind of, I'm interested again in maybe not how one performs labour, but how labour performs us. So how the whatever post-internet cultural condition informs a type of behaviour, a type of movement, a type of activity, and then again specifying once more into art how post-internet culture is performing post-internet art, and actually I think producing like an aporia, like dreadful situation in a way whereby you're getting this like stylistic mimesis and really like stupidity, art productive stupidity, which is hollowing out like what is a really important question, which is what is the post-internet cultural condition?
Mm-hmm.
Here artists deal with it, but then it's being reduced to a kind of like style,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore really interesting people are backing away from the question. And that for me is the thing, is how post-internet culture is performing artists today, is for me the question. How can we save that question from like a stylistic aporia? So I went off target there.
Are you going to jump in? But I mean, because I can kind of talk a little bit from like personal experience and what I understand of like peers' work who participate in this aestheticization of the internet or whatever the internet has become, because I don't even think there is a single internet. If you're asked to define it, it's kind of tricky. But I think that you're right to say it's caused a lot of people to step back and actually consider what is our relationship to these things, and what do I stand to gain in the moment of projecting this kind of what some people have referred to as like high internet, as a kind of like high modernism rather than it actually being post anything.
That's interesting because Peter Osborne's banging on about high capitalism. He said this all this late capitalism bullshit. It's high capitalism at the height of something. That's very interesting. Sorry.
Mm-hmm. But I think that one of the questions that arises from this in terms of not just thinking about the aestheticizing and how those things are transmitted, but the kind of earlier stuff that we were talking about. For me, one of the kind of key questions is, well, what does responsibility and ethics look like in that form? And it's very difficult if you to consider the use of those technologies and the sharing, the distribution of them as a form of colonialism, because in that context it's very difficult to recognize what your responsibility should be, because is it your responsibility? And I guess like I've always been very interested in the Luddites and where the Luddites failed, and how the narrative of the Luddites came to be written as I'm a Luddite because I don't want to use a mobile phone, but actually what the Luddites talked about was technology harmful to commonality. And I think that this really should be a kind of resurgent discourse of you begin to make decisions between the sorts of technology and communication that you think benefit I don't want to say community, but the kinds of forms of communication that you want to engage in. And I think in this moment, that's not something that we have a lot of choice around. I mean, this is potentially something that you understand better than me now.
I don't know. I mean, that's interesting. We do have choice around it, but maybe that's not highlighted enough, is what you're saying. And that you want people to have a sense that there's a cost to speaking this way as opposed to speaking this way, and define what that cost is and own that cost, like, so that every time you make a decision, that's on your mind. But that's not something taught or discussed that much. I mean, it is actually, it just came from Kritz at the digital media department at RISD, and that was a lot of the conversation, was the choice about why you mediate something, period.
Yeah, and what it takes to mediate something too.
What?
What it takes to mediate something too. You know, like what actually generates that possibility.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you mean, mediate.
Like why do you create, what is mediation of something? So where you put a skin between the idea and the experience of the idea. That's what I mean, like why use any form of media? It's a transfer process. Right. So it's like my skin is a mediation between the outside world and the inside world.
If you think about it that way, right? So that's kind of a specific ontological view.
Yeah.
Right, which is already creating kind of certain discrete boundaries. Mm-hmm. So, but it's obviously not the only way to approach it. Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, you could think much more holistically and question at what point one thing begins and the other ends, right?
Yes. I mean, it depends what you're, so from the perspective of the students, they have an idea, they want to express the idea, they want it to be received. Mm-hmm. So that's where we were talking about a choice of a medium, mm-hmm. and which is obviously different than media, but we were in the digital media department, so we talk a lot about mediation of an idea. So they had the it was defined by the concept they had that they wanted to express.
Yeah, I mean that Luddite question is super interesting. You teach at MIT.
I don't now, but
okay. Well, I was having a seminar with Joan Jonas, who teaches there as well, who's really great. Yeah. And we were talking precisely about the various escape vectors that conditioned the kind of post-68 fallout within the American counterculture, and a certain essentially Luddite tendency amongst certain radical groups that were heavily involved in the student movement, and then saw everything implode and moved upstate to farms and rejected kind of any idea. And that was just raising the question with regards to what you were pointing out, which is this notion of community. You know, and for me, the fallacy is precisely the possibility of a global community. Just don't think it's possible. Where I think community and where I think ethics might possibly reside is in a kind of like intensive localism, right? Which is also in a way an intensive individualism, but trying to like reclaim a sort of individualism from its instrumentalization by certain kind of political situations. So being happy, being local, and being happy in small groups, and finding ethical space within those, rather than try to project an ethical position globally online. I mean, don't think it's going to happen. Well, it doesn't feel like the right way. I mean, for me, I don't know what my ethics are on a ideological scale or a global scale. But I can certainly like sort of work out what it's like to be ethical face to face, you know, or to be ethical to the artists that I work with, or try to at least, or to create like an ethical scenario within a gallery space, right? That's all I can do. I certainly don't know how that would be translated or mediated by any sort of accessory arrangement.
But the hard thing is that local is so being redefined now, because one thing is local geographically, spatially, another is local temporally, and because people spend so much more time now in a different structure, there's a local that's defined by time, the amount of time they spend with those other people that they've self-selected, and there's a local that's who's in my neighborhood, who's in my work region, who's in my home space. So those have become further apart. They didn't used to be two separate things, and now they are. And they will only get, I think, further and further apart. So we have to deal with two kinds of sets of responsibilities.
And then in terms of people working on the other side of the world, who are part of this kind of like global elite of business transactions and business relationships, there's already like built into that structural imbalance in terms of like, you know, for instance, outsourced labor in India, they are up at night to be available for us in New York or London or wherever. And through that, they're speaking English, and so they're sort of like alienated from their daily life by being in this office, being awake at night, and then during the daytime, when their sort of like local life takes place, they're sleeping. And so it creates this really weird sort of like inaccessibility to any sort of like local community relationships for this kind of networked business.
Which is basic colonialism.
Yeah, right.
It's an alienation from kind of the norm, or alienation from one's own culture via the imposition of another's culture.
Yeah, right. And it's,
Yeah, I mean, I think to try and inject some optimism, like one
What
of
do
the
you mean?
I think one of the ways of like working back from that, I think one of the things that I always encounter, and particularly in some of the projects that I'm trying to facilitate at the moment, is this: when you use technology or you use things that can accelerate the things that you do or lower the transactional costs, there is always this aspiration to scale, and this is how we end up with situations where you have call centers in different parts of the planet where people are expected to perform a particular role to the benefit of those that will gain from it. But one of the things that I always think in respect to how these technologies and this idea of local can function is that maybe we just don't need to scale it to that. Maybe we don't need to have this kind of global conversation. Like, actually think about how a community operates and what is like the optimum like point for that. I mean, one of the projects that I'm working on at the moment is this unmonastery thing, which is tricky to explain in a couple of sentences and haven't quite got the elevator pitch there yet, but the idea is to create a kind of social centre, come live workspace that it creates infrastructure for the sharing economy. But these kind of physical spaces are designed to connect that kind of time difference between your local community. So there's a set of people online that you communicate with, that you're having a discourse with, and you travel to see those people. But people that are often working in that space aren't able to communicate the value of the work they do because it's not very legible. So the idea is to design this kind of infrastructure, and it's basically the communes of the 60s reiterated but with connectivity, so that you don't get the kind of calcification of like certain fixed ideologies and things like that. And that's the kind of beginning to think about the scale, so that you can travel fast between places, but you never try to expand to an exponential number of people. And I think, and I don't know, like I'm throwing around some kind of messy ideas there, but I think that's because this stuff is very, very emergent, and we don't actually know what this begins to look like. I mean, the big reason why a lot of the people are here and a lot of the people are like produce the work for Palazzo Peckham is because they were connected. Like a lot of people met online. Like we know each other.
Yeah.
Like this is so, and it does feel like a new kind of localism.
And I like that kind of idea of the tool as this kind of like focus object. And that's maybe why I think artists have the capacity to ask some of the most interesting questions of the world today, precisely because they're boundary people and because they have no specific tools, actually. Like, you know, what an artist will do with a tool that another person has a really like focused use for will be very different, you know. So personally, that's why I bemoan, but also still remain excited by the artistic encounter with, let's say, the post-internet, because it feels like we've only just begun, and yet we're getting all this crappy, mimetic styled garbage from everyone, and it's just like we need to push further with this question. Because artists can, right? We're so unburdened, especially, you know, the post-medium condition of the artist where one doesn't have to do anything particular. So we're in perfect position to like explore these questions and to explore tools.
And I totally had this theory that the conceptual choreographers in France, like Xavier and Jerome Bell and Boris Charmats, all those guys, are exactly talking about that transactional shift I was talking about earlier. Like I literally was in the piece of Boris Charmats in that school for Performa that they did downtown, and because it was like the perfect medium to think about transaction, because it is transaction, and you are forced to ask all the time, why am I putting meaning on this? Where is my memory? Such a critical thing I rely on to give something value. If I didn't have my memory, and I'm just making up my memory. There's so much awareness that the structure of his or that genre of art, conceptual choreography, it's a perfect align. You're forced into the box that makes you think all the time. I put meaning on my transactions, and my transactions are a step removed from the thing it's like. And then you think about all these different. There is an incredible synergy. I think you're right, and it is whether people will give a platform for that and value it, and
well, increasingly not.
Yeah.
Because increasingly that porous, non-specific, open sort of thinking is precisely what has been radically devalued by certain developments. Ironically, or I would say it's been radically appropriated, right? Because those are precisely the conditions of the archetypal neoliberal labourer, right? A sort of openness, a sort of capacity to think on, to be spontaneous, right? So, and yet, those precisely are the values that have been pushed somewhere else, away from a type of thinking towards another type of thinking. So I think it's like, how do we reclaim those for themselves, rather than seeing them pushed into a certain type of behavior or modeling. Yeah, I don't know.
How do you do that at an individual scale, personally?
Well, I don't know.
No? There's certain decision-making processes that you make yourself.
I guess like doing stuff like this and trying to talk about it is the start. Like being aware of being aware of how a type of artistic consciousness functions. Being aware of how that might be slightly different to how another productive consciousness might function. And then maybe beginning to ask the question, how might that consciousness be co-opted, and how might it be released?
I think at some point you mentioned that all this technology amounts to a new kind of subjectivity.
Yeah.
And I think that's, for me, it's like the most interesting thing. But, you know, going back to your original question about what is our frustration with the old vision of the future and what is the new promises of the future, when Norman talked about his project, I was just like, well, you know, we actually did not move that far, because we're still having, you know, it's like Chaplin's Modern Times, right? Or Fritz Lang's Metropolis, that you have like those slave workers feeding. So the difference between who has, and it's kind of interesting because you're talking about the skin and you're talking the mediation, it's all these metaphors for the other, right? So we are on this side of the screen, and on the other side of the screen, we have like children doing our screens in whatever part of the world that we don't know about that. So nothing changed. And you know, I'm gonna have to leave, and this is great discussion, by the way, but I was thinking all the way about when I was very young and I saw 2001 by Kubrick, and it's just like, wow, this is the vision of the future. And then you pan in that ship, and it's fantastic, and the guy is kind of asleep, and the pen is floating, and then comes a stewardess. And I was just like, well, you know, in the future, women will still be stewardess. You know what I'm saying? So it's like that kind of subjectivity. What is the new role of women? What is the new role of men in vis-a-vis of this technology? Or what is the role of Latinos and blacks, young people that, you know, in Google? So it's fantastic. I'm very hopeful, but there is a very kind of a, you know, tough, scary side to all this, that it's, you know, so.
I like the idea that the future will be no different, that it'll be the same.
I don't think it will be. I don't know. I mean, maybe, but, you know, I always go back to McLuhan and the Gutenberg Galaxy. Yes, you know, new technologies brings up new ways of subjectivities. But I think we often fetishize, you know, the technology.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's just like, I totally agree with you. The iPad is the new sheet of paper. Yeah. Of course, I'm much more fond of a sheet of paper because it's much more familiar to me. You know, that tactile thing or whatever.
Which is a lesson I just
But, you know, it's going to be like 50 years from now, when I'm not around, maybe people will have antennas and whatever. You know, I have no idea. But that shift of your rapport with the environment and with the other, right? And I think the rapport with the other on the other side of the screen, for me, it's like the big question, you know?
Yeah.
So
I think always asking the questions of where are we now and considering the both and around these tools. I mean, to me, it comes back to tools and presentness surrounding the tools and being conscious of the subjectivity surrounding them. And I think it's interesting that we started the conversation by asking, you know, where are we now with respect to technology? And you're right, we've created widgets. And so why have we created widgets as opposed to solving the world's great problems, solving hunger, potable water for everybody? And it's largely, and with respect to space, we really haven't advanced that much in space from where we thought we would be 50
We've gone
years
backwards.
ago. Exactly, and it has to do with funding and money and how these tools are being used with money driving it. And so as artists, I think it's extremely important that artistic consciousness that we spoke of, our capacity to use tools in different ways, that we can actually ask these questions and use the tools in a different way to get at some of these problems, some of these great issues that we're facing, much the same way that investigative journalists have taken over the role of informing people where traditional media used to do that. So I think consciousness surrounding the tools and understanding how we are present to communication, whether we're drawing or using an iPad, is extremely important.
When we're touching on that, the future isn't any different. The William Gibson quote, I think, always summarizes it perfectly, that the future is here, but it's just not evenly distributed. And I think Gibson really describes the kind of textual quality of the future, and I increasingly now find myself walking through places like the Chocodero in London, and it's just like, this is like straight out of a William Gibson novel. It's like, the future really is here, and it's really messy and like dirty, and it was never going to be that like clean like sheen.
I really absolutely agree with you about the kind of contemporary obsession with novelty and mutability, you know, and again, localizing things within art discourse. I think there is a real rupture in the idea of a kind of materialist dialectical art history, which I actually think is quite useful when we talk about post-internet art, you know, that people don't seem necessarily to be in touch with the idea of a kind of gradual development. It's all, this is new this, new this, new this. And I often think that occludes that project, but many other contemporary projects obsessed with novelty. By failing to ask the question, what is the same, we often lose traction on certain critical questions. By always proposing novelty and always proposing a kind of technocratic vision of progression over and above asking what hasn't changed, what is the same, I think sometimes we just push away a whole bunch of interesting questions. And I certainly feel that with regards to post-internet art.
And I think to talk about the kind of the program that you run, like you've successfully demonstrated that point to me repeatedly, where I've come to a show and it's like the Roy Ascott ground course stuff and talking about cybernetics, and it's like, oh, this is something I should really know about because we are rehashing this really badly right now. And there is a lot of there are repeated examples of those sorts of things, of like these questions, a lot of the questions that sit within like a young contemporary art discourse that's kind of concerned with post-internet in this moment. You look at those questions and then you come into contact with something like Roy Ascott's ground course, and it's like somebody asked all these questions before with a much higher degree of critical engagement and a higher degree of investment as well. And there is, I don't know how these things necessarily, how you end up with a lower level of investment in a lot of the work that you see produced now. I don't know whether it relates to like time, transactional cost, whether how you value one thing over another, because increasingly people don't value the gallery space. It just becomes another site, and the website's a site, and I don't know.
We're talking about the imposition, whether good or bad, of new technology. But think about the book. Think about movable type, and the incredibly short amount of time it took for movable type to be invented and disperse and essentially render obsolete the entire human history to date of information, right? Well, not entirely, but you know. So what did we learn from that? Why are we, as an example or as an allegory for the intervention of technology into a status quo, what do we, I don't know, what happened to people in their minds, you know? I don't know. I mean, that's what presumably McLuhan is.
A point that, I don't know, maybe shouldn't be recorded, but to make a point that maybe, humanism came out of, Gutenberg and the French Revolution and those things. The same way that now we tend to think that the Arab Spring came out of the social media, or, you know. So, but I think maybe it's too early to assess that.
Yeah.
But I'm always very cautious with this idea of the future, because I still think that the Renaissance guys, they are really futurists, because you know, I think the invention of this the canvas and the idea of perspective, we're still doing, you know, now it's just because we have emoticons and it moves or whatever, but it's in a sense we're still stuck in looking at a screen and kind of an illusion of perspective and depth, you know, and we have like voices coming out of that, but I don't think nothing really substantial changed in terms of how better we are from people in the Quattrocento, you know. I don't know, I think we're still Americans. I think the beginning of this talk was fantastic when you all brought up the idea of the market and you know, how transactions, and we're still stuck in that. You know, we're still an American kind of society. We did not reach to that level of utopia that all futurisms kind of point to, that it's you know, free for all man. We're not. You know, we're still, it's about markets, and it's very much who gets there first, and who creates the tools and stuff like that. And I'm not being pessimistic, I'm being realistic, because of course it's fantastic. I live in New York, I came here, I'm gonna go back, it's, you know, this is my future, present, or whatever. But I have no illusion that, you know, I don't think this is, you know, that utopian kind of thing. I don't think so.
But Ben, you lived through like what must have been the shock of a kind of mercantile realism through the internet, right? Because presumably you're the most post-internet person I know, so there must have been a time when you were caught up in precisely a type of techno-utopianism about how this thing might do X, Y, Z, and maybe you can speak a little bit about what you're talking about, which is mercantile realism, the moment when everyone suddenly went, oh, the internet's not going to do that, it's going to be just selling things like everything else, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of techno-utopianism was really difficult to shake off, and there's like a talk that I did when I was like 18 or something upon graduating that kind of used David Cronenberg's existence of like what happens when you can't tell the difference between this reality and the other one, and these are problems that we probably might have to face in some form. But I've definitely shaken off the techno-utopianism thing. But I mean, I spent 5 years, from the age of 13 to 18, I spent my life in Ultima Online, which was like the first massively multiplayer online game. And when I went to university, I thought, oh, why did I waste 5 years, despite the fact that I made quite a lot of money selling virtual gold online and stuff like that. And when I was at university, I was like, why did I waste all my time on this game for 5 years? And what I've actually come to understand is that it actually gave me like everything, and like I learned about how economies function, how communities function, like how you interact, how you can leverage with like multiple identities and stuff like that. That all came from that game, and it's a little bit weird in how these things now cross over into this moment where you have. There's certainly something interesting to gain in this perpetuation of an idea of a network society and how this stuff comes to function. And it's a facade, like it is, and now I understand what was going on in that game is just like a accelerated version of what we're doing in this room. I did just sit in the forest, cutting down trees, having conversations like this when I was 15. It just happens to be on a server.
Yeah,
like,
but that's the thing. So you learnt about the world just through an online platform, but you learnt about the world. It's the same as Paul Levi Bryant says, you know, computer games are the new novels, right? But it's still the novel, but it's just in a different form, which is why I totally believe, like, we just learnt the world is the world, if we're just going to access it differently. But
it didn't make us any smarter, it's a different way of using a tool.
Yeah.
And I think but I do think that we still have a responsibility to build a consciousness around how we're using these tools and how we can potentially use them in a way that actually solves problems.
So on that optimistic note, I think we want to end it with optimism. So thank you everybody for coming to the first Bloomberg Breakfast.